Something serious, deeply serious, is about to hit the United States, and what is most disturbing is that most Americans have no real idea of what is coming. They do not see it because they do not want to see it, because the media does not show it, and because decades of American exceptionalism propaganda have convinced them that their country is immune to the laws of history and economics. But let me tell you this as clearly as my many decades of study allow me to say it. No empire is immune. None of them ever has been, and the United States will not be the exception. I have spent more than 50 years of my life studying economic systems, financial crises, and the rise and fall of great powers. I have gone through archives, analyzed data, and watched patterns repeat themselves with almost mathematical precision. What I see in the United States right now worries me more than anything I have observed in my entire career, not because it is new, but precisely because it is old. It is the same pattern that has appeared before the collapse of every empire that once ruled the world. The idea I want to share with you today is simple, but it is also devastating. The United States is facing at least 7 major structural crises at the same time. Each one on its own might be manageable, but together they create a perfect storm that the current political and economic system is unable to solve. The reason most people do not see it coming is because each crisis is discussed in isolation, as if it were a separate problem, when in reality they are all symptoms of a much deeper systemic disease. Let me start with the most obvious issue, even though it is strangely the one discussed with the least honesty: national debt. As I record this, U.S. national debt is above $34 trillion. $34 trillion is such an enormous number that it becomes meaningless to the average person. So, let me put it in terms you can actually feel. If you divided that debt among every American citizen, including newborn babies, each person would owe more than $100,000. A family of 4 would owe more than $400,000 in federal debt alone, not counting mortgages, not counting student loans, and not counting credit cards. But here is what almost no one truly understands. The real problem is not the size of the debt by itself. The real problem is how fast it is growing, and even more importantly, how much it costs to maintain. For decades, the United States could pile up debt with very few consequences because interest rates were extremely low. Borrowing money was almost free. It was like having a credit card with 0% interest. You could keep spending and spending because the cost of carrying that debt was small. That world is gone, and it disappeared very suddenly. The Federal Reserve, trying to control inflation that it largely created by printing trillions of dollars during the pandemic, raised interest rates to levels not seen in decades. Overnight, that debt, which once looked manageable, turned into a monster that eats the federal budget. According to the latest calculations, the United States now spends more money on interest payments than it does on military defense. Let me say that again because it is historic. The country that spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined now spends more just on interest than on its entire military machine. And this is only the beginning because math does not negotiate. As older debt is refinanced at higher interest rates, the cost of interest will keep rising. Some analysts project that by the end of this decade, interest payments could exceed $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion every year that builds no schools, repairs no bridges, funds no hospitals, and produces absolutely nothing. It only pays the price of living beyond real economic limits for decades. And if you think this is already alarming, we are only getting started. The second crisis moving toward collision is the retirement system crisis. The United States is sitting on two massive demographic time bombs called Social Security and Medicare. These programs were designed in a time when there were many young workers for every retiree, when people did not live very long after retirement, and when medical costs were a small fraction of what they are today. None of those conditions exist anymore. Reports from the official trustees and administrators of these programs, not outside critics but government-appointed managers, show that the trust funds will run out within the next decade. When that happens, benefits will automatically be cut by roughly 20 to 25% unless Congress acts. And here is the real problem. Acting means either raising taxes sharply, cutting benefits sharply, or printing more money and pushing inflation even higher. Every option is politically deadly, so both parties have chosen the same strategy. Ignore the problem and hope it explodes when someone else is in power. We are talking about tens of millions of Americans who depend on these programs for basic survival, people who worked their entire lives with the promise that the system would be there for them. That promise is being broken, not by accident, but by calculated political cowardice. But let me take you one level deeper, because the government's financial crisis is only the surface. The third crisis is deindustrialization, which has hollowed out the productive core of the United States over the last 4 decades. There was a time not so long ago when the United States actually made things. It built the best cars, the best appliances, and the best industrial machinery in the world. Factories employed millions of people in stable jobs that paid enough to buy a home, raise a family, and retire with dignity. That era ended, and it did not end by accident. It ended because of deliberate economic policy choices that put short-term corporate profits ahead of the long-term health of the national economy. Companies realized they could massively increase profits by moving production to countries with lower wages, weaker environmental rules, and fewer labor protections. And they did it on a huge scale. First it was textiles and toys, then electronics, then automobiles, and eventually almost everything. City after city across the American Midwest turned into what we now call the Rust Belt. Closed factories, empty stores, communities destroyed by unemployment, poverty, and deaths of despair. And here is the part defenders of globalization rarely talk about. When you lose the ability to manufacture, you do not just lose jobs, you lose knowledge, you lose skills built over generations, you lose the capacity to produce, to innovate, and to respond when the world changes. Once that foundation is gone, rebuilding it is far harder than anyone wants to admit. When you stop innovating in what you produce, you eventually lose the ability to produce it at all, even if one day you want to start again. The United States learned this lesson in the hardest possible way during the pandemic. Suddenly it needed masks and could not make them. It needed ventilators and could not produce them. It needed basic medicines and discovered that most of the active ingredients came from China and India. The most powerful country in the world could not manufacture the most basic items needed to protect its own people. And if you think this problem has been fixed, let me disappoint you. Nothing has really been fixed. The dependence is still there. In fact, in many critical sectors, it has become even deeper. The United States now imports around 90% of its advanced semiconductors. These are the chips that power everything from your phone to the most advanced weapons systems. If tomorrow Taiwan stopped sending chips, the U.S. economy would slow down dramatically within weeks. This brings us to the fourth crisis, which may be the most dangerous of all because it involves the position of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. For 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, the dollar has been at the center of the global financial system. Countries hold their reserves in dollars. International trade is done in dollars. Oil is sold in dollars. This special position has given the United States what a French finance minister once called an exorbitant privilege. In simple terms, the U.S. can print the money the world needs and use it to buy real goods from other countries. It is like having a credit card that you never have to fully pay off because the world needs your debt as a reserve asset. This privilege has allowed the United States to live far beyond its real means for decades. It has funded endless wars, huge trade deficits, and a level of consumption that no other country could sustain. But this privilege depends on one key thing: trust. The world accepts dollars because it trusts that the United States will manage its economy responsibly and will not abuse its power. That trust is fading, and it is fading fast. First came the financial crisis of 2008, when the world watched Wall Street almost destroy the global financial system through greed and fraud, and then saw the U.S. government rescue those responsible instead of holding them accountable. Then came massive money printing, trillions upon trillions of dollars created out of thin air, which pushed inflation onto the rest of the world. After that came the use of the dollar as a weapon, sanctioning countries, freezing reserves, and cutting entire nations off from the global financial system. Each of these actions sent the same clear message. The dollar is not a neutral global public good. It is a political tool that the United States will use whenever it suits its interests. And when you control the world's reserve currency, using that power as a weapon is the fastest way to lose it. The results are already visible for anyone willing to look. Central banks around the world are reducing their dollar reserves and increasing their gold holdings at a pace not seen in decades. China and Russia have built alternative international payment systems. Trade between developing countries is increasingly done in local currencies without passing through the dollar. Saudi Arabia, a key pillar of the petrodollar system, is selling oil to China in yuan. None of these changes alone destroys the dollar's position, but together they signal a shift in direction that, once it gains momentum, is very hard to reverse. When the dollar eventually loses its special status, and this is not a question of if, but when, the United States will have to live within its real limits for the first time in generations. That adjustment will be harsh. And this is the critical point. All of these economic and financial crises are unfolding at the same time as a deep political and institutional crisis that makes any clear response almost impossible. The fifth crisis is the paralysis of the U.S. political system. The country is more divided than at any time since the Civil War. It is not just that Democrats and Republicans disagree on solutions. They do not even agree on what the problems are. They live in completely different information worlds, with their own media, their own experts, and their own versions of reality. Congress is practically unable to pass meaningful legislation on almost any major issue. Budgets are approved only through constant emergencies and repeated threats of government shutdowns. Appointments are blocked for years. Infrastructure projects that would benefit everyone are delayed or stopped by partisan fighting. The system is built for stagnation, and stagnation is exactly what it produces. At the same time, the Supreme Court has become another political battlefield, with decisions that often reflect ideological preferences more than a consistent reading of the law. Election results are regularly questioned, no matter who wins, and a large part of the population has lost faith that the system can represent them or solve their problems. This crisis of legitimacy may be more dangerous than any economic crisis, because even if technical solutions existed, there is no political mechanism to put them into action. The ship is taking on water, and the crew is too busy fighting each other to fix the leaks. The sixth crisis is social and cultural, and it is linked to what some sociologists call deaths of despair. The United States is the only developed country where life expectancy has been falling, not because of war or a pandemic, but because of suicides, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related diseases. These are signs of a society that is deeply unwell, of people who have lost hope, who see no future, and who are being crushed by a system that has left them behind. The opioid epidemic alone has killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined, and it continues to grow. It was not an accident. It was the outcome of pharmaceutical companies that lied about how addictive their products were, of doctors who prescribed